Are theoretically live from Seattle. Let us get our opening logo on the road. Welcome to Evolution Hour, September 23rd, 2024, in the wee hours of the morning on the Pacific coast of the USA, in the exciting world of tortuganwordpress.com. All that stuff at the website for those who want to share it. Freebies. Yippity doodle. Okie doke. As you can see, we are not in the den. We are over in our relatives in Seattle, having a happy little birthday here in the wee hours, and continuing the exploration of ankylosaurids in Titans, and a part 2 that will be relating to some Michael Oard that popped up from a 2023 post that he has, which spills over into the climate science denialism that circulates in so much of the creationist subculture. But we will proceed accordingly. So, the next little bit, he's got a Sarfatian Tay on the ankylosaurids, is just Ankylosaurus directly per se. No source citations, just simply alludes to it, puts out the specifications of the thing. For those of you who are aware, ankylosaurids are those big armored tank-like ones, and the ankylosaurs have a club at the back end of the tail, as opposed to nodosaurids that aren't. And we discussed in previous week, hi, don't forget to vote. Oh, absolutely, that is positively a given. And for those of you people who aren't registered to vote, but are entitled to, this is a really important election, so you want to make sure you are definitely registered to vote and definitely going to do so. And hopefully not for the convicted felon nincompoop Trump, or for any of his, air quotes, GOP Trumpistas who are enabling him up and down the ballot. Anyway, that's a little political given on here. So anyway, on Ankylosaurus then, I decide, heck, let's give you some sources, even if our little buddies at CMI don't. So there's a 2021 paper, open access, on a new ankylosaurid from Mongolia, with indications of the selective feeding rather than bulk mode, as in relatives. In other words, that there's a microevolutionary variation in the dynamics of the ecology and what forms of plant life these critters are eating and under what circumstances. Do the creationists have any model for any of that? Is that an acceptable amount of variation within a kind? Who knows? Because they never get around to dealing with it. The very next taxon in Sarfatian Tay is jumping back over to the nodosaurids, Borealopelta, which did get a citation from a 2017 paper by Brown regarding the issue of whether it could be determined if its body was countershaded based upon the discovery of melanosomes molecules that are related to skin pigmentation. And the irony is that there is a fairly substantial phylogenetic analysis in that paper, which naturally Sarfatian Tay didn't deal with, let alone offer a young Earth creationist perspective about the interrelationships of ankylosaurids within the supposed kind. That would be the sort of thing theoretically baraminology could do with those two families. Remember, they left out that little problematic family. That was an indication of the stuff that was hard to classify as to which family it belonged to. Just by leaving out so many of the data field, they can avoid developing any viable baraminological interpretation on here. So we're plowing down to the tail end of that chapter that will then be moving us on into next couple weeks. We'll be into the hadrosaurs. Oh, hi, yes, yep, it's been a while. The cute part then for number 2 of the show is actually the one that has the most source citations in it. Regarding Sarfatian Tay, because we're now moving off into the hadrosaurs, the initial installment that I'll be doing will be kind of scoping out more about the tail end of the ankylosaurs, and then in the week after that, we'll be sliding into the hadrosaurs, where we'll be looking into how many kinds they register and how many species they're dealing with, and a rough indication of how much they're leaving out, as well as kind of an eyeball on how much of that is being reflected in the ARC encounter over at Answers in Genesis. Interesting little stuff. So an awful lot of this material is stuff that's going to be showing up in a chapter in, I would be pointing over my shoulder at rocks were there, the volume 2 of that, if I were at home, which is going to become I think, hopefully, a very useful field guide to how Answers in Genesis approaches the kind list. And remember, Answers in Genesis listing of kinds in the ARC encounter is the lowest value of anybody in this field, only 1,400 kinds. This is way below what you find in Woodmarap and a lot of these others, where they're really talking about maybe tens of thousands of kinds without going into a detailed list. Anyway, part 2 relates to a thing that popped up in Michael Oard from last year. Ice Age megalakes did exist in the Sahara, which is in the Journal of Creation, and I'll be putting up a link to all of that stuff. And this is an issue that we've alluded to a couple times in previous episodes, and that obviously is an obsession of Oard and company, which is about whether or not there was a green Sahara at one point, and there were these glacial megalakes and all this other stuff, which is an absolutely fascinating amount of geologic material on. But this section here that we're dealing with is also spilling over to paleoclimate issues and how you determine paleoclimate issues in relationship to dealing with current understanding of how climate works. And that's where we're bumping into the whole issue of whether or not young Earth creationists are basically climate change deniers. So anyway, most of the sources that Ord's put in are just recycling material that he's done before. But he did hit 2 new papers. And one of that is Drake 2022, which turns out to be available open access. Oh yeah, this is one of the most critical features involved, because back in the 17th, 18th century, it was perfectly feasible to imagine that only the species were kept on the ark. And that would be easy peasy, because that means human beings, as our unique species, is a created kind. No problemo. But as the number of species climbed up into the thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions, and throwing in all the stuff from the paleontological record, that became increasingly untenable, to the point where virtually all upper echelon creationists have thrown in the towel on that species identification and go up at the more traditional biblical view that created kinds are kind of family level. But there's a problem, because then aren't human beings in the primate kind, the primate family. So they have to have a double standard as to hair-splitting things to keep human beings as a separate kind, but keep things broad enough so that they can keep the number of ARC number down. And I'll give it to the ARC encounter. I mean, you got to give them props for sticking rigorously with that family approach, which can bring it down to 1,400. Of course, they're leaving out all the arthropods and nematodes and invertebrates and all that, in addition to all the critters that live in the sea and all of that. So it's just simply go, oh, well, we don't have to worry about any of that. They weren't on the ark. Simple peasy peasy. Now, when you move over into Joe Blow creationist, they haven't got the memo on this, to where they are still stuck in the idea that there is no speciation and that speciation is impossible. And so they think of created kinds still as species. So there's a ginormous disconnect between what goes on in the upper echelon creationists, who have blown out the window the idea that created kinds could be species. But the people in the grassroots, many of whom may be marinated in 1970s and 80s creationism, and relatively few of the newer breed really pay all that much attention to the relatively limited baraminology literature to begin with. So it's kind of an in-house thing that happens in the upper echelon creationists, but doesn't really filter downstream to the hoi polloi that you encounter on Twitter, or who make idiot YouTubes. Anyhow, back to our dear friend Oard. So Oard is arguing that this paper from Drake, 2022, which is, let's see if I got the print out of it here. Sedimentary and geomorphic evidence of Saharan megalakes, a synthesis. And it's quite a nifty little blip. I think the link that I'm putting to is of the draft of the paper, and it goes into quite considerable detail on, I put some annotations on it, the ancient Lake Chad, and these other things that are going on that they've been working out. As you can see, the entire Sahara was not lakeified, but it was obviously much a richer environment back 15, 20, 30,000 years ago or so. And so the Oard is saying that the Drake papers skirt around the elephant in the room, which why was there much more precipitation than there is today? Marinated and odd euphemism for indoctrinated, but nice fit. Yeah. Well, I like to use the word marinated because remember, your average creationist is soaking up stuff, not monolithically. Many of these people don't really connect up with a particular doctrinal subdiscipline. So they're not necessarily only following Answers in Genesis or only following Institute for Creation Research. A lot of them may be dominant in that field. Their apologists in that frame tend to be very, very insular, just as Sarfati and Tay tend to be very finicky and tend to reference only stuff that cycles within that Creation Ministries International network. But the average creationist floating around is much more of a smorgasborder. So you find somebody like Standing for Truth sort of glomming on to Nathaniel Jensen and Sanford and whoever else seems to be handy. If you've got somebody in the Kent Hovind orbit, they tend to be relying on much older material and then just getting little scattershot stuff that they've been getting off of YouTube. So it's an interesting little thicket of things. But it's not the kind of example that you would have of a monolithic creationist movement where the doctrinal position is being very carefully nurtured all the way down the line. Otherwise, you wouldn't see the amount of variation that we do among creationists, especially in like the new creationist breed who aren't necessarily wedded to the viewpoints of people from the Dwayne Gish era. But anyway, I digress again. So Oard is effectively accusing them of avoiding the issue of how climate shifts to where you have more rain going on in the Sahara region, except the paper hadn't skirted that issue. And so they were about reviewing the existence and extent of not only the ancient paleo lakes, but along the way noting about the main model for that increased precipitation, corresponding to, quote, peaks in insolation when the intertropical conversion zone, ITCZ, is situated further north and the monsoon increases in strength. And they cited two papers on it, one of which, one from 2000 by Domenical, is available open access. So you'll be able to at least see that 2000 paper. And there's also a very nifty 2015 review of a lot of this newer material on the end of the African human period that I'll be putting a link up to. By the way, the links I'll be putting up to after I get back to Spokane. And exactly when I'll be doing that, well, it depends on how circumstances are. Anyway, so all of that is connecting up to the natural cycling of the Earth's orbit, Milankovitch cycles and all of that, which Oard's worldview doesn't want to have as an effect. We get that. He doesn't like that, bla puis. But the problem is that other works are corroborating that all the time. And there's that particular 2015 paper, which is unfortunately not available open access on the stepwise climate shift in the region, but that's the one that the Domenical 2015 summary is reviewing. So you'll be able to get the basic upshot of what's going on in that context. And Oard, ironically, actually mentioned the ITCZ explicitly several times and cited a couple of his own creationist papers as to trying to fit that into the Big Slosh biblical rapid ice age model. You can have fun going through the little sidebars to see how much data field he's missing in that point invariably. it'll sort of be material that will be coming up again, not so much in Rocks Were There Volume 2, but in a future work that Jackson and I plan on doing on creationist conspiracy theories and all that stuff, of which climate science denialism is playing a part. So we'll be returning to that little issue, that it's extremely difficult to find anybody in the anti-evolution movement that has a grip on that. And you can find a few little outliers in the non-creationist worldview that don't like climate science. Ian Plimer, the Australian anti-creationist, has a figure in that. He wrote a book that is just impenetrably unintelligible. It's an amazing how anybody could write hundreds of pages and never actually say what the hell their position is an interesting little phenomenon. And the late Glenn Morton, who was a young Earth creationist and then kind of abandoned that, but still he kept a little bit of that Tortugan mindset in his skepticism about climate change. So that's a wonderful little sidebar that we'll be having on that. Next week, of course, depending on whether I'm home or not, I'll still be doing a show. Yes, Trumpiste says, yes, that's, I like to use that rather than Republican, because I'm old enough to remember Republicans, actual real live Republicans, people who had a spectrum of politics, and all the way back to liberal Republicans, the Nelson Rockefeller wing of the party, that kind of got vaporized by the time you get into Reagan. And then that group began to implode in the period after the Reagan period. Into a hyper-conservative party that not only had shorn off even most of its mildly conservative people, but also was now starting to move more and more into an extremist right wing that wouldn't have been allowed into the party at all in the William F. Buckley era in the 70s or so. MAGA, the Scarecrow Army, yes. And so I don't like using the whole point about referring to them as Republicans, because I think it's an insult to Ronald Reagan and that legacy. So that's basically got the show part in. Let me put up our thank you note to all of our patrons, without whom things would be much more difficult to deal with than they are. Let's get our little share screen on here. Zat. And so our colleagues and researchers and assistant researchers and friends and legacy patrons who've helped the show over the years, I couldn't get along without that. And it's every little bit helps. And it's a big thank you note for everybody who's still giving thumbs up to the project in ways other than just normal likes, but actually shelling out money to keep the project running as it is. Because remember, there's no corporate sponsors for the thing. It's not like Midas Touch or others where they're hawking various sponsor material. There's no commercials popping up in the middle of things. I'm not monetized in that way. So the Patreon account is a major factor, and also royalties from the books, which both fiction and the nonfiction. And the links are always in, and link to the Patreon is linked up in every episode, which I will be putting in after I get back to Spokane. So, yes, it's going to be a really fun thing next month. Of course, we're going to be having a conference here in Spokane on Christian nationalism, and a little spotter's guide that I developed will hopefully be given out to all the members of attendees to see a little bit clearer the interconnecting layers of wackadoodle that pops along in here. I've done a couple posts on it at Spokane Faves on the findings that I had come up with, and one just this last week on the Donald Trump's debate with Kamala Harris about how he basically was letting slip the answers to methods questions the reporters didn't ask him, which helps reveal more about his over-reliance on Fox Trump Pravda pundits, his over-acceptance of the flapdoodle that, and it's vile flapdoodle, that J.D. Vance was putting out about Haitians from Haitian, he said in a later speech. Yes, sure, J.D., you went to Yale and you think Haitians come from Haitian. Good dog. okay, I think you need to get out of this. Yes, links brain network damage to increase. Yeah, there's quite a lot of cognitive literature things, a lot of which is going to be spilling over to a future book that Jackson and I plan on doing, which may be a 3-volume Little Mother by the time we get it done, on the origin, evolution, and structure and political dynamics of religion, not just the Judeo-Christian niche, but the whole big picture issue of it. And there's quite a lot of research on working out. There is no single religion center for the brain. It's an interconnection of things. But when you've got certain brain connections or systems that overfire or underfire, that can contribute to things of not just religious fundamentalism, but tendency towards conspiracy thinking and such like. So it's a fascinating subject with an awful lot of technical literature, which, by the way, I keep track of in my tip research, which your Patreon is helping to continue to underwrite, to study how much of the creationist movement bumps into particular areas. And cognitive literature is almost completely invisible across the entire anti-evolution spectrum. So they will talk about soul, and they will go on about how we don't know how language originated, and suddenly they're quoting a bunch of stuff from Noam Chomsky, but not diving into the rather extensive and mounting technical literature on any of those topics. We'll be alluding to a little sidebar about that topic because it comes up in human evolution in the relationship of our social systems and the development of language and the like. Erica Gutzik-Gibbon has been keeping track of this material. In fact, quite a few papers that I hadn't been aware of. She is always keeping track of all that because that's in her field of primatology. Well, there's most everything that's really complex about human behavior is coming about from multiple brain systems. We have, for example, 2 completely different brain systems, neither one of which is dedicated to doing moral reasoning, but gets utilized in moral reasoning. And one of them is a snap judgment, emotion-driven, amygdala-based unit, and another one is pulling in a more slow, deliberative frontal cortex system. And those 2 things can have crosstalk as to how the moral issues are framed and how people can rationalize. Self-deception, for example, comes about from the anterior cingulate cortex, among other things. So you have a complex mix. And I think one of the reasons why it's been so difficult to isolate, like, is there a stupid section of the brain, is because there are no stupid sections of the brain. The kinds of things that come into play when we reason badly or come to faulty conclusions are from systems that are running normally and get feedback in terms of what we weight and which things we prefer and what we decide to not think about. And so it's an interesting little subject matter, which hopefully, if I can get some more people involved in the psychological field to start poking around in this fresh way of looking at it, we'll see what happens as we get more books on the line. So anyway, that pretty much covers what we've got going here. As I'll probably keep this as a fairly truncated episode. Let me put in my little advert for the rocks were there that Peter came up with. Okie doke, and over here to share screen. At least I got a little mouse to make it a little bit easier to connect stuff up. And away we go. And there's our little advert. Um, the thing that is constantly striking me is this constant churning of incoming delicious information. So what we're attempting to do for the new volume of Rocks is to make it as up to date as possible in terms of keeping up to date with the creationist literature and the material that they're arguing, as well as the technical science literature that bears upon that, and even more importantly, the science information that bears on the big picture stuff that the creationist isn't dealing with. And so we ferret our way through all of that, I think, in as effective a way as possible. I'll be trying to make the index even better than the one we did for the first volume. Oh, yes, there we go. Yes, it's everybody stay safe on things. At the moment, we're in kind of a lull in the Pacific Northwest for icky climate, so it's not too hot. It's kind of about in the normal bit, although there's been really bad lack of moisture over on the Cascade side of things. We're not getting fires like we're having in California and other areas for a while. A couple of weeks ago, we're still getting quite a lot of fire smoke from coming up from Oregon. And then, of course, you got all the mess with flooding and locations, not merely in the United States, but terrible flooding in Poland and stuff that's just hit Japan. For anybody that follows the Japanese television feeds on cable. And as my niece tends to, she's a big sumo fan. And fire hazards and the like in Greece, and that. So it's a dicey climate situation. Whether or not the nincompoops in the Trumpista party or their counterparts in various political areas around the planet want to think about it, you got to deal with it. And in many respects, military and companies are forced to thinking about this because they have to pay ultimately attention to reality. And so you're going to be having situations with rising insurance rates in areas that are becoming more prone to problems. Nincompoop Trump thinking that sea level rise is going to be over centuries and just enough that and it just makes more seacoast. No, it's actually the opposite. It actually can reduce seacoast. And Florida is a hilarious example. Mar-a-Lago would be underwater eventually. And the coastline of what would be left of Florida in a big sea level rise is less because you don't have that big long panhandle. You have it cut off north up in Tallahassee, that sort of thing. But presumably Mr. Trump does geography in the same way that he does hurricane paths. He just takes his Sharpie out and rearranges stuff and just ignores the actual reality of things. So my position would be that scientific illiterates should not be in political power because they make really bad decisions, and we can't afford scientific illiterates anymore. We could muddle along with it 50 years ago, 100 years ago, but now, sorry. And so everybody that's way younger than I am, 72 years old, had jolly well better pay attention to voting because the decisions that will be made or not by the people who are in power or not are going to affect your future. We're building the future that you're going to either be living in or regretting that you're living in based upon what we do now. So there we go. You have a hurricane that's pretty likely to miss us. Yeah, and one of the terrible things about these modern storms is not so much that they're more powerful than existing storms, but that they often travel way slower. And so they rain and rain and rain and rain and rain on a area so much that it completely overcomes the drainage system and you get terrible flooding that way. This is part of the new dynamic of it. And Mr. Trump may think he can go out there and like King Canute, command the tides to stop. No, ain't going to work that way. So anyway, yes, Mar-a-Lago. Yes, it's the old post mansion, which could theoretically be turned back into a national landmark and a museum of Trumpian stupidity, and they could dismantle all of the resort part that he put in. If the regime finally changes and the DeSantis types get out, technically speaking, Donald Trump has been breaking the law in using Mar-a-Lago as a residence. His lease absolutely forbids using Mar-a-Lago as a personal residence, and yet he has that, which means he would have to give back all the tax breaks that he got based on the structure of that lease. So it's entirely possible that, presuming he loses in November, there will be yet another one of the little swords of Damocles that is about ready to hit the guy from all the mess that he does. So anyway, everybody stay safe where you are, and have fun reading our material, and help out the project as you can. Spread the word if you can. If you want to stir up trouble in your local public library, get a copy of the books and donate them to the library. Maybe they wouldn't be so troublesome with the fiction books, but Rocks for There and Evolution Slam Dunk might get a little bit persnickety. But nevertheless, most public libraries will accept donations. And so give that a thought, as well as they make hilarious gifts for your friends who may not like what they get out of there, or the ones that will like it because it's sciencey stuff. So anyway, everybody stay safe. Watch out for wooden penguins. And we will be seeing you kids next week. 31 minutes in. Okie dokie. So we will